So, if you are involved in book social media in any way, then you've probably at least heard of the concept of a TBR list when it comes to your reading. So, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about TBRs. We're going to talk about what they are in the first place, how some people mean different things when they say a TBR versus what somebody else might mean, and why in 2026, I am completely ditching the concept of a TBR in my own reading. As always, thank you so much to all of my Bindery members, the Dragons Reborn, but of course also the Dark Travelers. I appreciate your support so much. So if you're involved in book social media, you've probably at least heard the term TBR thrown around, although I know I've even talked to a couple people who don't quite understand what the term means. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about what a TBR is and why it means different things to some people. So a TBR stands for a to be read list. And this is basically a list of books, generally speaking, that you are interested in reading. Now, it's interesting because when you look at how different people talk about their TBRs, it can mean a lot of different things. And if you look around on BookTube, you will notice there are tons of videos where people talk about TBRs. A lot of them, they'll make games to help them pick the next book from their TBR. They'll talk about how their TBR has gotten too big and overwhelming, and so they're trying to whittle their TBR down. Or in some cases like this video, people will be talking about why they're getting away from using a TBR in the first place. So we're going to start out broad, and then we're going to kind of narrow things down a little bit. So in the broadest sense of the term, a TBR list is literally just kind of any list that you have that helps you keep track of the books that you want to read. And for me, I do have what I would call a want to read list on my book tracking app. So I primarily use Storygraph. I use Goodreads as well. And we're going to talk in another video about the pluses and the minuses of all the different book tracking apps. But I use that not so much as I'm definitely going to read this. More so, I use those book tracking apps as a, hey, here's books that I've heard about. Here's books that I may want to look into. Here's books that I may want to read. But it's most definitely not an all-inclusive list of books I want to read. And it's also most definitely not something where just because I put a book in my Storygraph want to read, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm definitely going to read that book. And in fact, in a lot of cases, somebody tells me about something, I'm like, oh, cool, I'll check that out. I go in, I put it in my Storygraph, and like 6 months later, I come back and I'm scrolling through and I'm like, what is this? I look it up and I read about it a little bit, and it's kind of like, oh, that's definitely not for me. And we take that right off. So to some people, any generic list that you have of books that you might want to read is what they would consider their TBR. And so when you do see people talking about ditching the TBR or ditching the concept, a lot of people will respond to it with that. Well, like, you definitely have books that you want to read, so you're not really ditching a TBR. And that's true. I'm not ditching the idea of keeping track of books that I might want to read. More specifically, when we talk about book content and we look at what book content creators are doing, when they talk about a TBR, they can also talk about it in the sense of a physical TBR. So you will see a lot of people who will show their bookshelves that are filled with hundreds of books that they've purchased, that they own, but that they haven't read yet. And that is a very common meaning when people say what their TBR is. And that's where we get a lot of the videos about like playing games to pick which book I read off my TBR next, hauling or unhauling my TBR, to read or not to read, unhauling books, all that stuff. That generally is people referring to a TBR as physical books that I own that I haven't read yet. Now, I am a big proponent of people should enjoy books however they want to enjoy them. And I definitely do think that book collecting is its own valid and unique hobby, and it's different than book reading. And there are some people who are book collectors. There are some people who are book readers. There are some people who do a little bit of both. And I think that's totally cool. Now, for me personally, when I look at like that description, a physical TBR, I personally don't like to have a ton of books that I own that I haven't read yet. One of the first videos that I ever made and posted on Instagram and TikTok in the book world was about how I think people have huge TBRs. And for me, that would be very anxiety inducing. And for some reason, whatever it is, I don't know totally why. When I look at a giant stack of books, and sometimes even when I look at my bookshelf that I have here and I'm looking at all the books that I have, I'm at the point right now where I think I probably have about 30 to 35 physical books that I own that I haven't read yet. Ideally, traditionally, I've liked to keep that 10 or less. For whatever reason, for me, when I have a ton of books that are just sitting on my shelf that I haven't read yet, it makes me kind of anxious and it makes me get a little bit wishy-washy and indecisive about what I want to read next because I've got so many options. And I think also it's to do with the fact that there's so many options for me and for us, generally speaking, to get books out there. I've got my local indie bookstore. I've got a Barnes and Noble near me, the library, Libby, ebooks. I've got the Kobo that I use. I have got audiobooks that I listen to. So there's so many options for me to get books in a really quick time. For me, I don't like plunking a ton of money into a bunch of stuff that is just sitting there on my shelves when I know I can get most things that I want kind of whenever I want. I think this also has to do with the fact that I'm not a huge special edition person. You can obviously see if you deep dive on my shelves back there, I've definitely got some special editions, but I'm not a subscription member to like the Broken Binding or anything. I don't tend to buy a lot of special editions unless it's a book I really know that I love and that I enjoy and I want that kind of shelf trophy for. So totally respect the people who love the physical TBR, who love having hundreds of books. No shade whatsoever. If that's your thing and that's what you want to do, that's great. But for me, that's also not what I'm talking about when I say I'm ditching my TBR, because I like to keep a physical stack of books relatively low, try to read them and not try to have a lot of them sitting around unread. So then what do I mean when I say that I am ditching my TBR? Well, in this sense, I am talking about the idea of a TBR being a monthly or a yearly list of books that you say, this is the list of books that I'm definitely going to read this month or this year or within any specific time frame. When I first started doing book content and engaging with book content, I noticed that pretty much most creators out there do a monthly wrap up of the books that they've read, and then they do a monthly TBR. So they'll say, here's what I read in January, here's what I'm going to read in February. And I kind of thought, well, I'm making book videos. That's something I should probably do. And so last year, for the first time ever in my life, I had never done this before. I had never even considered this before because at heart, I'm a mood reader. I started making a list. Now, that pretty quickly fell off because, like I said, I am 100% a mood reader. I read books kind of spur of the moment. I pick them out. I decide, hey, I want to read a thriller right now. I want to read a horror book. I want to read this book in particular, and I go with whatever my mood is. So I think that's one of the reasons that I never even considered making a list of books that I wanted to read, because it was just like, I just pick the next book when I go to read the next book, and it's never been something that I would consider planning. Now, it is interesting to me because in a lot of other aspects of my life, I actually really love having a nice, solid plan and having things kind of defined and laid out and knowing what I'm getting into. I love having a schedule. I love having an idea of where my week is going to go or my day is going to go. But reading is kind of my escape. And so I think for me, I look at reading as this is where I don't have to be scheduled. This is where I can be a little feral. And this is where I can do whatever I want to do and read whatever I want to read whenever I want to read it. But again, flashback to 2025, I started making some book content and I was like, all right, I'm going to make these videos. I'll start doing some of these TBRs. And I pretty immediately noticed that I didn't like that idea because I was starting to have bad experiences with books that I thought I would otherwise probably like, but I knew I wasn't necessarily in the mood to read that book. But because I put that out there and I said to people, hey, here's my TBR for the month, I sort of felt like, well, people are going to want to see what I thought of it. So now I kind of have to read it. But again, I was getting to the point where it was like, I'm not really enjoying this book. I can tell it's a book I would enjoy if I were in the mood for it. But I would press on because, again, I've made this list and I've kind of put it out into the ether and I want to meet people's expectations. So I pretty quickly figured out, yeah, I can't do this. Like, I'm definitely going to read these books this month sort of thing. So what I switched to was starting to make videos about my monthly hopefuls. So I would say, here's 10 books that I hope to get to this month, but I'm giving myself leeway. And I'm saying, if I don't really feel in the mood for this book, I'm definitely not going to read it. And that was a little bit better. It felt like there was a little bit more freedom with that. But I will say, because again, I was talking about those books, I would get people being like, hey, you said you were going to read X. What did you think of it? Or, I know I saw you said you were going to read this. Why didn't you get to it? And what did you think of it? And did you read it? And kind of all these questions and that sort of thing. Because of that, I really stuck to that list. I would say on average, when I was making those here's my monthly hopefuls, I was probably reading 75 to 80% of the books that I said I was hopeful of reading in those months. Now, reading for me is such an important thing. It's such an important part of my life. as I have rediscovered my joy of reading over time, it has reminded me so much of why I love reading. It is something that is good for my mental health. It helps me stay calm. I enjoy learning about other worlds and other people and looking at things from a different perspective. And I just enjoy being lost in a book. It is something that is centering for me. It is something that just helps me in so many ways. And so when that started to feel like a bit more of a chore, and I started feeling like, oh, I skipped this book, but now, like, because I skipped it, I'm feeling pressure to read it because I said I might read it last month. And so now I've got this pressure. Maybe I should read this now. It started to make reading feel like a little bit more of a chore to me. And the other thing that I started to notice was I was kind of soft DNFing more books than I traditionally would. Now, for me, when I DNF or did not finish a book, the vast majority of the time for me, it's not a I'm never going to read this again or what people call a hard DNF. For me, it's usually a soft DNF. I usually recognize because I'm a mood reader, I'm not enjoying this book right now. It's something I will probably enjoy when I am actually in the mood for it, and it's something that I will come back and revisit later. And I noticed I was doing that more and more. I was more and more getting a third of the way into a book and being like, man, I'm not in the right place for this. I'm going to put this book aside completely and then come back to it at some point when I think I'm actually in the right headspace for it. So when you combine the fact that I was starting to feel in some cases like reading was a chore, when I was starting to feel some of those expectations, and then when I noticed I was not finishing a lot of these books that I was trying to read because they were on this arbitrary list that I had made, I realized that as I headed into 2026, I wanted to stop doing this and wanted to return to reading being just a completely feral mood reading experience once again. Now, at the time I am recording this, we are just finishing up the month of January, and January was one of the more fun months that I have had reading. It's interesting because I had a big array of ratings for books. I had a couple 3-star books. I had a 5-star book or two. But I just had so much fun exploring whatever it was that I wanted to explore and reading whatever I wanted to read at the moment. Now, there are going to be a couple of things that I will say are a little bit more of what people might argue is a to be read or a have to read. So in January, we started a book club in my Discord. So if you go down to the links down in the description below, there's a link to Bindery, there's a link to Discord, and I'll talk about Bindery a little bit more here in a second. But I run my book club through Bindery and Discord, and so my Discord and Bindery members get to vote on and pick the books for each month. So in January, we read Lies of Locke Lamora. We're doing Project Hail Mary here in February. And then we're doing Malice by John Gwynne in March. We pick them in 3-month stretches. So I do know that there's at least one book every month that is not necessarily my pick, but it's something I'm going to read. I had a ton of fun with that. And so to me, that kind of adds to the spontaneity almost a little bit in the sense that other people are picking these books. I get to read them and talk about them with other people. So even if I don't necessarily enjoy reading the book, that experience of discussing that book to me is going to be something that is super fun. Now, the other thing that is sort of a you're going to have to read it kind of deal is that my Bindery paid members get to pick a book for me every month. And so if you're not familiar with Bindery, Bindery is a book-focused social media platform. They invite people to be tastemakers, and I am fortunate enough to have been invited to do that. And so I've got this page. It's kind of part blog. You can post videos there. I post my YouTube videos on there as well. I post Instagram and TikTok videos and stuff on there. I do individual write-ups. There's a free membership, and then there's also a paid tier membership. Now, amongst the perks for the $5 a month paid tier membership is that my paid members get to pick a book for me that month, and it can be whatever book they want. If it's a romance book, if it's something they think they want to just see my reaction to because they think I'm not going to like it, if it's a book they want to read along with me, if it's a book that I haven't read that they think I really love, they can pick whatever book they want for me and I will read it. In January, they picked Dark Matter and I read that. And then in February, we are going to be doing, I believe, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, yes, surprise, somehow I haven't read that book yet. But to me, again, that is not so much of a, you're being forced to do this. It's another fun, spontaneous thing that I get to do because I have these people who are generous enough to support some of this work through a paid membership. And then we get to experience this book that they picked for me together. And again, something that to me doesn't feel like a book I have to read. It's something I get to read and that is spontaneous and that's fun. And I think is going to introduce me to a bunch of stuff that I might not necessarily have picked otherwise if I was sticking to a strict TBR. So I am really excited to get back to my roots and just become a full-on feral mood reader, reading whatever I want, whenever I want. And it's very interesting because everybody reads differently. And I recognize that just because this is the approach that is really going to work for me, I would certainly never tell anybody not to do a to be read list. So on the flip side of this coin, there are some people who actually get incredibly overwhelmed with not having a list of things that they want to read. I know that I have talked to some people who they say, if I just look at my bookshelf and I don't have some kind of a plan, it gets overwhelming. I don't know what I'm going to read. And then I just wind up not really reading anything because I'm too overwhelmed. So I like to have a plan. And if that's you, that is fantastic. And you should absolutely read in whatever way you like to read. There's no rules about how we all do this. We get to do this whatever way we like. Some people really like to have that strict plan, and I think that's fantastic. Now, maybe you're somebody who's halfway in between. Maybe you are noticing some of the things that I notice, like you've tried to do a TBR, and it just feels, for whatever reason, a little too strict for you. But then when you go to pick a book, you have a little bit of sort of analysis paralysis, and you're not totally sure what you want to read. And so you're like, well, this list at least gives me stuff to read, but I'm seeing some negative impacts on my reading as well. What do I do in that situation? Well, what I would advocate you do is when you go to pick a book, pick like 4 or 5 books that you're interested in and that at least seem like interesting to you. Limit it to like 4 or 5. Don't go crazy here. Read a little bit of each one. You can read a chapter. You can read 5 to 10% of the total book. If you're an audiobook person, listen to the first chapter or go and listen to like the preview and just read those first couple chapters and see what grabs you. And I did this recently at the end of January here. There were like 4 or 5 books that I was like, man, I really kind of think I would like to read all of these right now. And I'm not totally sure which one I want to jump into. I had just finished book 9 of The Wheel of Time. And I kind of was like, well, maybe I want to go into book 10. There were a couple of nonfiction books I wanted to read. I had an arc of the Book of Fallen Leaves, and I was like, what do I do, right? And so this can be the downside of not having a TBR is you don't have a plan. But what I did was I read a little bit of each one. And for one of the history books, it was One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. I read the first chapter of that, and I said, this is great, and it's important, and I need to read it. But it's also a little bit heavy, and I should just do like a chapter a day and kind of reflect on that. So I set that to the side with that plan in place, and that's what I'm doing. I'm reading a chapter a day of that. I read a little bit of On Writing by Stephen King, and I was like, this is fun, but it's not something I'm in the mood for. Put it aside. I read part of the prologue for book 10 of The Wheel of Time, and I was like, you know what? I don't want to jump into book 10 right now. I want to read something in between, and then I'll do this next. And then eventually it came down to The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and again, the arc for A Book of Fallen Leaves. I really liked both of them, but I just found myself kind of back and forth between the two, really being drawn back to the Book of Fallen Leaves. So that's what I wound up doing and kind of focusing on. And that was a really successful experiment in like, if you're not sure what you're going to pick, just read a little bit of a bunch of them and find the one that really speaks to you and go for it. So I am really excited about this. It is really fun to just not really know where I'm going with my reading and just have a blast kind of meandering along the path and reading what I want. But obviously everybody is so different. So I'm interested to hear from you guys. First of all, when you talk about a TBR, what does that mean to you? When you hear the phrase to be read list, a TBR, what's the first thing you think of? Do you think of that all-inclusive list on your tracking apps that are all the books that you may want to read? Do you think about like the physical TBR, physical books that you own that you haven't gotten to? Or do you think of it more as like that monthly or bi-monthly or whatever time length it is list of books that book creators and other readers make that give them a guideline of where they're going to go? And then I'm also interested to hear whether you're somebody that likes to have a plan for your reading or whether you're a little bit more like me. Are you a full-on just feral mood reader, or are you somewhere in between? So thank you guys for watching. Interested to hear your thoughts on TBRs. Appreciate your support, and we'll see you on the next one.